This is the last part of my four-part series on Moran of the Lady Letty. It's entitled Hair and Hoakum, Mixed Reviews from the Press and from Rudolph Valentino. All the glowing studio publicity pumped out for Moran of the Lady Letty, as illustrated in the ad you can see on the screen, had to meet the test when reviewers saw the film. The reactions were mixed, and theater owners reported much different levels of audience interest depending on where the film was shown, and this applied to Valentino himself as well. Reviewers emphasized different aspects of the film, such as the action and the appearance of the cast, with some being unimpressed and others being very favorable. Although most wrote straightforward reviews, there were some harsh, even caustic and sneering opinions aimed at the two leads. Here are two examples of the first reviews after the premiere in New York City on February 5th, 1922. The review on the left was from the New York Herald, and that reviewer remarked that the plot line strained credulity a bit when it came to a girl remaining alive all night after the ship's fire that killed strapping men. But the critic thought Dorothy Dalton generally gave a forceful characterization of the girl who wanted to be a man, except when her hair gets into her performance. This critic was fixated on the actor's hair and overall appearance. To bob or not to bob was evidently the burning question that faced Miss Dorothy Dalton in girding herself up for this picture. The critic regretted that she trimmed her hair to the length standardized for horses, and, quote, it seems to hang in strings of licorice around her face. The ordinarily enchanting countenance of Miss Dalton becomes as broad-beamed as a ship, and her charming smile turns into a hatchway. Now, Valentino got off relatively easy with the comments from this reviewer, such as this one. Quote, as evidence that his rough experience before the mast works a transformation of character, he no longer wears the patent leather hair comb of his San Francisco trifling. And how about this comment? Quote, one feels that even when he is sloshing water from a bucket, that he could change instantly into his best party manner and slosh tea from a cup. By contrast, the Daily News reviewer McElliott heralded Valentino as a much-needed new hero and considered the release of Moran of the Lady Letty as real news. He valued the film at about 98% and remarked that, quote, this man Valentino has a pair of fists with him, my dears. But Dorothy Dalton came up short again as she looked, quote, oddly boyish and perhaps a trifle grotesque at moments in seaman's clothes, and the straight bob locks made famous by one Buster Brown. Now, in my notes, I have a lot more information about Buster Brown and some pictures of me in my own Buster Brown haircut and shoes. But Buster Brown was a comic strip originated in 1902. The name was inspired by a young vaudeville performer named Buster Keaton. Now, Buster Brown was a child of wealthy parents who was a prankster, essentially a Dennis the Menace type, and his dog was believed to be the first talking pet in a comic. The dog would warn his master of the trouble he would create, but the warnings were unheeded, and Buster would be spanked, although it wasn't clear if he really repented for his actions. So, if you want to learn more about Buster Brown, go to my notes. A couple of days before the Los Angeles premiere, February 12, 1922, a syndicated review by James Dean, Dateline New York, began appearing in newspapers. It started off with a dig at Valentino. Quote, it had to happen sooner or later. Francis X. Bushman used to get away with it with considerable regularity. Wally Reed has been guilty of it several times. Yes, sir, Rudolph Valentino, Rodolfo, what's his name, Valentino, just had to peel off his shirt and get out in front of the Kliegel lights sooner or later in his sleeveless undershirt so the flappers might gaze upon his manly muscle. Then Dean moved on to Dorothy Dalton and her hair, quote, shorn to within 8 inches of her scalp. They finished his summary by praising director George Melford for not dressing Dorothy up in evening low cuts and, quote, allowing her to go right through the fade out in her raggedy outfit without a wave or a ribbon in her hair, unquote. Ultimately, Dean praised both Valentino and Dalton for their work. In his opinion, it was Dalton's best film in months, and Valentino's best work since he had been in The Four Horsemen, in spite of the sleeveless undershirt. And here's the sleeveless undershirt that critic James W. Dean heartily disapproved of. A couple of weeks later, a review in the St. Louis Dispatch had the exact opposite reaction to the actor's work. The critic said that the plot was well worked out, though not original. The marine views were worthwhile. But he thought Valentino and Miss Dalton, quote, have been seen to better advantage in other offerings, unquote. He did note, though, on the program there was a highly diverting comedy in which cowboys used automobiles equipped with saddles. The plot right from the beginning was questioned right after the premiere by the New York Herald in the article above, but at least it called Dorothy Dalton's performance a forceful characterization. But the Baltimore Sun review also found fault with the story, failing to find it a convincing piece of drama. But it went further. It showed no mercy toward Dalton, calling her, quote, well nigh hopeless, unquote, while passing off Valentino's performance as, quote unquote, lacking. And I'm going to quote extensively here now. Quote, Dorothy Dalton fails to breathe a real soul into the role of the captain's tomboy daughter. Rudolph Valentino, perhaps, does the best he can with 6 reels of fighting a viperous sea smuggler, but his performance, too, is lacking, save for the grand finishing fight amidst the topmost rigging. Some publications, however, picked up on the idea of the pairing of Valentino and Dorothy Dalton. A paper in Washington State, while calling the film fanciful, did note that it would please those who like, quote, Valentino's style and Dorothy Dalton's masculinity, unquote. Now, the writer in the April 1922 edition of Photoplay also picked up on the pairing of Valentino and Dorothy Dalton. First, he called the film basically pure hokum, so much hokum that, quote, you're almost ashamed of yourself for enjoying, unquote. But he wasn't sure why he really found the film enjoyable, except that he said that it could be because, quote, of 2 sparklers, such as Valentino and Dorothy Dalton, unquote. Now, he said that Dorothy with the bobbed hair and Rudolph as usual, yum, yum, you're bound to like it. A paper in Delaware described the pairing as, quote, well nigh unbeatable in screen circles. The cream of beauty to both the feminine and masculine sense, and the best screen ability are found in the two. It's very interesting to note that the term beauty was being applied to Valentino at this point. So far, we've seen many mixed reviews about this film, but this review out of Canada actually glows. It doesn't talk about the plot. It focuses on the 2 actors. About Dorothy Dalton, the writer says, quote, she brings to the part a conscientious forcefulness and withal betrays that womanly sweetness, which cannot be disguised by either her manlike dress or her strength of character. Her portrayal is a revelation of art, unquote. The reviewer says this about Rudolph Valentino, quote, as a petted society favorite, proves that beneath his lavender kid exterior, he is a real man, and in the end, he conquers even the intrepid Moran. This is a role in which all the robust qualities possessed by Mr. Valentino are brought to the front with splendid effect. His portrayal will not be soon forgotten, unquote. One thing I like seeing was that Walter Long did get some attention in some reviews and publicity. He certainly was a great villain, and it was really nice to see some articles which mentioned him specifically. The review in the trade publication Variety on Friday, February 10th, 1922, called up some questions about the acceptability of the characters and the actors in this film. It starts off with Dorothy Dalton, calling her, quote, a new type of heroine, unquote. Quote, the sinuous frocks are gone, so are the vampish headdresses. It's an astonishing transfiguration from the typical Dalton roles, unquote. But the reviewer also stated that, quote, whether the fans will accept Miss Dalton in an ingenue part of this kind is an interesting consideration, unquote. because the character of Moran was rather a, quote, colorless person, unquote, in translation to the screen. The review went on to say that the real star of the picture was Valentino, and noted that, like Dalton's changed image, the change in the Valentino persona as a quote-unquote fighter was also a big shift in style, and maybe even a shock. The reviewer wrote, quote, as a rough and tumble fighting hero, Valentino is a revelation. Physically, he looks the part, but it comes as something of a shock, probably because he has so long been identified with roles of a daintier kind. A couple of slides back, I showed a snippet from the Exhibitor's Herald review, and that review, which is on my blog post in full, actually assumed that Valentino's image would really be boosted because of his ability to fight. What you're seeing on the screen is a sampling of reports from theater managers sent to Exhibitor's Herald for a section called Voice of the Box Office. These reports showed how films were being received. During the run of Moran and the Lady Letty, Valentino's earlier films were still in circulation, including his hit films, The Sheik and Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. These two hit films were still bringing in large audiences, so in effect, Valentino was competing against himself, not only in terms of box office, but also in terms of his image. A comment in an Ohio newspaper revealed a potential problem with Exhibitor's Herald's conclusion that Valentino's ability to fight would boost his popularity. While commenting that Valentino, quote, proves he can ride the bounding mane as gracefully as he does the camel, unquote, the public was warned that they wouldn't be seeing a sheik. And here's the full quote. Anybody who expects to see Rudolph Valentino syndicate the Sheik and Moran of the Lady Letty is doomed to heartbreaking disappointment. There is not a tent, a turban, or a turbulent lover visible, even in the silhouette. And apparently some of the women fans were not enthralled by what Variety's review had called the shock of the physical change in Valentino and the disappearance of the Sheik character. Here are two field reports from Exhibitor's Herald from the same exact edition, the same time. One is from Evanston, Illinois. The Sheik had been rebooked for a third run and was turning away crowds, while the theater management in Omaha, Nebraska, reported that Moran of the Lady Letty started off well enough during the first half of the week, but Valentino as Ramon Laredo was missing the mark with the female audience. And this is what the theater manager said. Moran of the Lady Letty, quote, Rudolph Valentino in this role does not appeal to the ladies, unquote. Rialto Theater, Omaha, Nebraska. Versus the Sheik, quote, rebook it, men, it's there, you won't lose, unquote. Hoyburn Theater, Evanston, Illinois. Columnist Harry Carr, in his column From a Car Window, reviewed Moran of the Lady Letty within the broader context of the state of the movie industry, specifically noting the tragic feminine stories, and he wasn't particularly enthralled with Moran of the Lady Letty either. Carr thought that Moran of the Lady Letty missed the mark in terms of direction and story. He pointed out that the audience had to get over, quote, the sea atmosphere, unquote, to get to the story. But, quote, the director did not get over the atmosphere, unquote. Overall, he thought the character of the girl raised on a boat was not believable, which is a problem we had seen before in other reviews. Carr apparently met Valentino on the set of Blood and Sand, which was already in production when Carr's piece came out in March of 1922. And according to his report, Valentino was not thrilled with Moran of the Lady Letty either. Carr described Valentino as being, quote, a weary traveler who has at last arrived at an oasis, unquote, by being given the lead role in what looked like a good one in Blood and Sand. After telling Carr that he hated the Sheik, Valentino found some consolation in his role in Moran of the Lady Letty because he wasn't a lounge lizard and he could look like a fighting athlete. And here's the full quote. Quote, "But," he said yesterday, adjusting his gorgeous bullfighter costume, "you can always find consolation in everything. That picture gave me at least an opportunity after so many lounge lizard parts to show that I could be a fighting athlete." As we wrap up here, I have to say that for all the mixed reviews and the back and forth over which actor was the star of the film, with the ads alternating between Valentino and Dalton, there's no question that the momentum with the public was with Rudolph Valentino, as Moran of the Lady Letty was released. In fact, before the official premieres of the film in New York and Los Angeles, moviegoers in Stockton, California had an early chance to see the film, and the publicity clearly skewed toward featuring Valentino. In fact, this review touting Valentino's magic shows that the person responsible for using the studio publicity in the Stockton Evening and Sunday Record seemed to think that the film was already bringing in crowds from all over Stockton and the country as well, even before it went into wide release. After the film opened in New York on Sunday, February 5th, Variety reported in its February 10th edition what was obvious. Valentino was the draw on Broadway, and Dorothy Dalton hadn't even been mentioned in the advance billing. To conclude, of course, Dorothy Dalton will get her due in many venues as the film rolled out around the country because she was a popular player. But without a doubt, Rudolph Valentino was definitely starting off his busy year of 1922 in what had been described as, quote, stellar fashion, unquote. Of course, at the end of this piece, I have all my notes as well as my sourcing, and I hope you've enjoyed this video as well as the entire series. It was 4 parts, it was long, but I had a lot of fun doing it because I got some really good details and insight into the filming of Moran of the Lady Letty.